All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Brian Shane, and I am currently the chair of the history department down in Athens at Ohio University. But I'm very pleased this summer to be joining the Chase Center as one of the associate directors for academic affairs. So it's great to be here, and thank you, Lee and Heather, for all of your Herculean efforts, and Jeremy for pulling all of this together, and you all for being here. Our second panel here, after we've discussed sort of the utility of thinking about civic thought, is how we have it. And we're very fortunate to have four great people with expertise in this area. I'm going to introduce all four of them to begin with, and then we're going to start with Stephanie and John, who are national leaders in some of these fields, discussing and engaging each other in the articles that you were pre-circulated, and then we'll move to Michael and Aaron. So first, Stephanie Shonekan, who is the Dean of the College of Arts and Humanities and Professor of Musicology and Ethnomusicology at the University of Maryland. So this is somebody who can speak towards Susan's importance of music that Aristotle taught us. John Ross is the professor of the practice in the School of Civic Thought and Leadership at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and directs the Moorhead Cain Scholarship Foundation's Dialogue and Discourse program. Michael Neblo is professor of political science and director of the Institute for Democratic Engagement and Accountability at Ohio State University. Aaron Yarmel is associate director of the Center for Ethics and Human Values at OSU, and I noticed has done some tough and challenging work dealing with children, which is also something that came up in our last panel. How do we think about some of these questions? The guiding questions for this panel are: what are the conditions of civil discourse? And to what extent do controversial topics benefit from a lens of a common curriculum versus a more a la carte approach? So we're going to start off by having Stephanie and John sort of engage one another, share some of their ideas, and expand on some of their ideas. And then we'll turn towards Michael and Aaron, who can talk about a lot of the great work that's happening here at Ohio State University.
I'm
seated there.
I'm seated.
Do you need to not be seated?
I
That's
have
fine.
some
You're
notes.
not. You can.
Sorry.
You have the floor.
Thanks for having me. Can you hear me? So I'm going to speak more to the first question. What are the conditions of healthy civil discourse? Why was I asked to speak on this? Well, I suppose because for the last 6 years I've been trying to teach classes on civil discourse, first at Duke University and now at UNC Chapel Hill. I'm not a likely person to be doing what I do. My training is in Christian theology. I wrote a dissertation about open-mindedness and intellectual diversity from a Christian perspective. The only classes I am probably qualified to teach are classes in like the introduction to Christian theology or Christian ethics. I do teach those classes, but I also teach a number of classes in politics and civil discourse. That happened because I arrived at Duke, my first job out of graduate school, in 2018, and started teaching the sorts of classes I could teach. And meeting with my students, as I often do outside of class, I noticed that they were admitting to me that they found it difficult to have political conversations in the classroom particularly, but also in the dorms, and that they were self-censoring out of fear of social or professional penalty for having the wrong views. In certain cases, students would explain to me that they had the quote-unquote right views, but they were worried about them coming out wrong or being misinterpreted. And I also sensed in these students a deeper desire to have an environment in which they could have these conversations. So their emotions were divided. There was fear on the one hand, and as I said, a desire to have these conversations. So I thought, okay, I should do something about this. And I did what college professors do when they want to try something out and they're not so sure of it. I created a freshman seminar because they're easy to impress, and they don't know any better. You just say, this is how we do it here. So I did that, and the class was called How to Think in an Age of Political Polarization. And I was careful in my title to use the word how, not what. And it was a class that foregrounded the intellectual virtues, which I'll say a little bit about shortly, of charity and humility and so on, as a way into having these hard conversations. And I suppose if there's any through line between my research and what it is I spend most of my time teaching now, it is intellectual virtues. So what happened in this class? Well, it worked, and not because I'm some kind of student whisperer. It was because there was a real unmet demand for a class that even attempted to try to create such an environment. The students really responded first by signing up for the class, and then by being game, as they say. And it didn't happen right away, but it did happen. And so I thought, my goodness, we need to do more of this. And so I started teaching this class over and over again, and it kind of became known on campus. And reflecting on it, I wanted, and what's worked and what hasn't, I just wanted to offer a few tips for those of you who plan to do this kind of work. I'm not the type to theorize a lot. I'm more of a practitioner, I would say. But here goes. I like to begin class, and by that I mean the first day, the first 2 days, by making very clear to the students what this class is about. It's not a debate class in which one side is going to win, one side's going to lose. You're not here to own the other side. It is a class where we learn how to have hard conversations. And so we come in with a collaborative rather than a competitive mindset. I think it was said by one of the audience members that effective polarization is more a state than a trait. This has been my observation as well, and that's a good thing because you can get people out of states. Traits are harder. And one of the things I ask of my students is that they observe the Chatham House rule. So this is not Vegas rules. Vegas rules is what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Chatham House rule is that no attributing putting names to things said outside when going outside of class. And the reason I like that rule is that I actually want students leaving class and say, hey, guess what? We had a conversation about this, and somebody said that. And other students go, whoa, really? And this is the ripple effect that was mentioned earlier. You can change wider campus culture by having a big impact on 20 or 25 students who then go out and they're your apostles. So Chatham House rules. And the other thing I'll say about that is I don't want students to think about that rule as like a legal contract, or these syllabi these days, they just get longer and longer, and they seem like legal contracts, don't they? I have all this stuff I'm supposed to put in, you know what I'm talking about, right? The copy and paste. I do none of it. Because it sends the wrong message. So I want my students to think more about what we're doing there as a moral pact rather than a legal contract. Let's buy in, let's do this thing together. And so the reason you wouldn't violate the Chatham House rules is not because you signed an NDA and you have legal liability, but because that'd be kind of crummy, right? Your fellow students put themselves out there, and then you punish them for it. And we agreed we weren't going to do that. We were going to reward courage instead of punish it. And I got to say, that's actually a much more powerful thing in my experience. Okay, guideline number 2, assume goodwill. It seems so obvious, and yet we violate this rule all the time, all of us. If you think about how you interpret other people's remarks just in a given day, you'll quickly do this, right? You'll attribute some motive to their reason for believing something that they don't claim to have, and it's usually something unsavory, right? Or like epistemically not all that respectable, right? So the kind of rule of thumb in my class is don't say something like, you say you believe that because X, but you really believe it because Y. And I'm quick to tell students that there are times when people are of bad will. Like they're not saying they are, but they are. Like this happens. It happens in our country, surely. But given that, as I said earlier, the point of the class is to have hard conversations, just practically speaking, it's best to give people the benefit of the doubt, because nothing will shut down a conversation quite like somebody insisting that, no, you really believe that because you are a bigot or whatever. It's just forget it. It's over, right? The other thing I'll tell students is nobody's ever convinced anybody that way. I've never in my life observed somebody like shamed into saying, you know what, you're right. Like I admit it, and I hereby agree with you and renounce all my prior beliefs. Like this doesn't happen. So the question is, what are we doing when we do that? And you realize it's not that we're actually trying to persuade. We're trying to embarrass, and that's a different goal, and it's not the goal of my class. About embarrassing, I'll point out to my students that Amanda Ripley's book, High Conflict, talks about this, that one of the common preconditions of high conflict is humiliation of one of the parties. So there are times when you're going to embarrass the other person, and unintentionally, but what I say to students is don't, try to avoid it. Try to unnecessarily avoid embarrassing somebody. Whatever you do, don't humiliate them. Right? You'll make an enemy forever. And when you do that, you're revealing what your real motive is, right? You're trying to dominate the other side rather than persuade, rather than enter in maybe some kind of friendship with them ultimately. I have a buddy who uses this phrase, friend, come up higher. I like this phrase. It's when you're engaging in some kind of fraternal correction, or what you think is correction, right? You think you're right. You're extending this hand of friendship and saying, I actually want you on my side. You're made for better. Like, come with us, rather than we're going to cast you out. You are forever, bad and wrong, right? Okay, so assume goodwill. Humility has been mentioned this morning already. I think it's key, both intellectual and moral humility. Students, if they don't already know it, need to be told that they got a lot of things wrong. They will continue to get things wrong in life, and that they are morally fallible. This is so important. Curiosity is a virtue that I speak about in my class. It means, among other things, thinking in real time, not coming into classes with prepackaged conclusions. Like we go through all the controversial issues of the day in my classes, and don't come in, I say, like thinking, I got to get here, because that's what my side thinks. Think in real time, wherever that might take you, and that's a scary thing, especially to like these risk-averse students. Being curious, in my opinion, also means wanting to know other people's views on something, regardless of their identities, right? So I think one of the traps sometimes you fall into when you're having difficult civil discourse, I've seen this happen, is, well, okay, we're talking on this issue, so only women can talk on this issue, right? And so we kind of go around the room, we see who has most at stake, and then we defer to that person, and whatever she says, we feel like we all have to agree with, right? And then, so there's something happening there. I would say it's not a classroom. There's learning happening, but it's not a Socratic method, and I think it's unhealthy. So what I'll say in my class is, we're going to discuss just war. Well, has anybody ever served? Has anybody ever been in a war zone? You have extra credibility, right? But it's not exhaustive, and it's not exclusive. Otherwise, we can't have a discussion. So I think this is important. Courage is everything. I think without it, you're not going to have the other virtues. And I think, if I can criticize higher ed for a second here, I think it's a lack of courage that's kind of got us into the mess that we're in. And the only way out is to be more courageous. The other thing about courageous is it's contagious. Courageous is contagious. Courage is contagious. And because I've seen this over and over in my classroom, a student will, offer something that's a little bit brave, and then lo and behold, another student will find his or her courage. They're like, okay, I actually think this. And it's kind of a gift you give each other. Free speech is, I've come to believe, as much or more a collective accomplishment than an individual right. Like a lot of people in this room, I support the Academic Freedom Alliance, and I want the Kelvin Report adopted in the Chicago Principles. All these things, right? They're great. But if you're really going to change culture, you have to change hearts, change norms, and that's something that's deeper. You can have all the rules you want. Students have that right to free speech, but will they exercise it? That's the real question. Be patient. One lesson I've learned is not in my classes to jump to hard case studies right away. I spend a fair amount of a month or so, kind of talking about talking, and I think some mistake that can be made is that classes in civil discourse, or let's say like faculty training, only ever talks about talking, and they never actually get to the issues because that's a little bit safer. I think when I started out, I was like rearing to go. I was like, we're going to talk about, and I was too far in the other direction. I was like, all right, let's go. Let's transgender athletes. Let's have at it. You don't want to do that right away. Be patient. Build trust within the room. That's essential. Your success in doing civil discourse well with students will be a function of, I think, largely your ability to build trust, goodwill, and community with them. Those are the things you need. Above all, be charitable. I think that students, when they think about love, they think like the romantic, intense feeling. And I introduce them, I say introduce because they probably never heard it, to a notion of love as willing the good of the other. And they think, well, that's different, and maybe I could do that with people who see the world differently. Maybe I could do that with my classmates. And I try as much as I can to practice what I preach. I try to be charitable with the authors and with the students in class. I interpret things in what seem to me like the most reasonable fashion. I don't try to embarrass anybody. And I think that when you do that, you create a different atmosphere. How am I doing on time here, Melka? A few more minutes. Okay, good. I get students, if possible, to I'll use the phrase, put politics in its proper place. I think they overestimate the importance of politics in their identities and in the meaning of life. And part of my job as a teacher, in order to make it easier to talk about politics, I need politics matter less. And I do that by, among other things, like reminding them of all these other things in life, all these other spheres of human experience, and these other roles we have, be it as a father or mother or brother, sister, as a friend, these other spheres of life, like love and beauty that transcend politics, that are pre-political or apolitical. I think it was said by Susan that we've gotten to a point where like the political identity is really, really high in the ladder of identities, and in part because probably the religious identity is dropped and we have a vacuum. I think that's absolutely true. And I think something similar is happening with gender. That combined with the online world has made that more important to people. And so reminding them of other ways they can understand themselves in the world that is not political, I think is really, really helpful. I'm running out of time, but just one last thing, just in case we don't get to it in Q&A, I wanted to say, since I'm here at Ohio State and you're starting this school, and I've helped start one at UNC and watched others start it at other state universities. And if you haven't already experienced this, you're going to be met with criticism of your schools. And one of the panelists mentioned that we need to get beyond the conservative liberal thinking when it comes to civil discourse. Get ready for people saying, "Oh, I know what this is this is a conservative thing. Civil discourse, and this is interesting how this has happened. Like 10 years ago, if somebody said, civil discourse is going to be a conservative thing, like when you hear free speech, that's a conservative dog whistle. I would say, that'll be, how are we going to get there? Well, here we are. It's very interesting. And we can go into why it's wrong, but my point is, like, be ready for it and be ready to answer. And what I have done is, yes, you can make the arguments, like write them out, why that's wrong, go into the history, quote John Stuart Mill, all this. But I think the best thing to do is simply to answer with your actions. And I have tried as best I can. I'm not perfect, but in the way that I talk to colleagues at my school, colleagues who maybe are outside of when I say my school, my university, maybe outside of my own school of civil discourse. And of course, when I'm with students, to really lead with virtue, to not be partisan, to be fair, to really introduce them to like a liberal inquiry in the classroom. And I think if you do that, then it's much harder to dismiss, it's harder for other people to dismiss your efforts as somehow politically motivated. That would be my advice to you. Thank you.
Thank you for that, John. Now, Stephanie, you can feel free to share your quite considerable experiences in one of the topics that we haven't talked a lot about, which is the role of race, and your efforts to teach that in a very charged environment. And you can respond as you see fit to anything that's been said. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I'll sit here. I'll follow the rules here. Sorry, Jonathan. So thank you for having me, Jeremy. Thank you for inviting me. I'm very excited to be on this panel. Any chance I can get to talk about the journey to this point for me is an opportunity that I will take, because I think there are many lessons that I have learned coming up to the point where I am Dean of the College of Arts and Humanities, and the really difficult job that is right now. But it's made easier because of the experiences that I've had in academia. So I want to kind of take you on a quick journey. This is my third year of being dean, and if you can imagine, my first year was all right. Second year was the war in the Middle East, Israel and Palestine. College of Arts and Humanities, you can imagine what that felt like for our faculty, and being in the DMV also was really interesting. And then, of course, in this third year, we are dealing with all the ramifications of this new administration. So there's a lot going on, but I feel like I was prepared for it because of the work that I did at the University of Missouri. So quick journey, but this is it's important to kind of lay out why I think civil discourse in the classroom is critical, especially when it comes to very difficult topics like race. So in 2015, if you'll remember, the University of Missouri had a really public, incredible student movement around race. In 2014, Mike Brown had been killed in St. Louis, which is just 2 hours away from Columbia, where the flagship is, which is where I was teaching. I was the chair of the Department of Black Studies at the time, very new chair. Didn't really want to be chair, but the previous chair kind of looked around and said, "Oh, I'm out." So my colleagues voted me in. I was still an associate professor. But they felt that I would be the one. And then this movement happens, and you all remember it a little bit, yes? So the students said, what does it feel like to be on a campus just 2 hours away from where Mike Brown's body lay for 4 hours? Many of our students were from St. Louis or Kansas City or Chicago, so from these very urban spaces near Columbia. And they also felt that the university wasn't doing anything. Nobody said anything except maybe in Black Studies classes. And they just felt like everything was going on as normal. Also, students felt that it was enough. It was enough to be walking down Greek Row and be called the N-word every day, or be harassed when they were practicing their step shows, or years earlier to have a Black cultural center and have white students put cotton balls out on the lawn of the Black Cultural Center as a sort of symbolic reminder of who Black people were. So the students said, it's enough. As an institution, could you please help us to process this in the classroom, in programming? And the leadership said nothing. In fact, the students confronted the president of the university, who said, and they asked him, how do you define systemic racism? And his response, and it's on YouTube, so you can look it up, his response blew me away, blew all of us away, because at the time we were saying to the students, calm down, it's all right, it's all cool, it'll be okay. But the students said, no, we need action. If they don't do anything, then we want somebody to step down, the president, the chancellor. And we said, even if the chancellor or the president stepped down, it's not a solution. There was a student on a hunger strike. I mean, it was dramatic. Hunger strike, and he said he wouldn't eat until the president and the chancellor stepped down. And many of us were trying to urge him, listen, don't lose your life over this. But he was adamant. And then the video came out of the president answering the question about what is systemic racism. His response was, systemic racism is when you people don't think that you have access. And that was the moment where a lot of the faculty thought, okay, we actually need a president that understands what systemic racism is, especially in the context of the mid-2000s. So folks were antsy, and then the football players stepped in. And the football players said they would not play or practice until the young man ate his food. And it's an SEC institution. They need football. So at that point, there was pressure. The coach, wonderful coach, supported his young men. And miraculously, a couple days later, the president and the chancellor stepped down. So in all of this, I'm processing it. I grew up in Nigeria, so I have read a lot. I have studied a lot. My minor in my doctoral program was African American Studies, so I knew a lot about this kind of thing, but to actually see it, to see what students were doing on a campus, which 50 years earlier had also happened, which allowed for people like me to be on campuses like this. So it was an incredible moment, but I'm thinking, it's 50 years later, surely it's not the same level of racism. And then one day I was walking across campus, running to a meeting, and the student in the front desk of Black Studies called me in tears. I said, what's going on? And she said that someone had called the office and asked if that was Black Studies, and she said yes. She was a freshman at the time. She said yes, and the person on the other end said, good, because I'm casting for the Planet of the Apes. And she just, for a young girl to have to deal with this level of racism from an adult was stunning. And I thought the students were absolutely right. This feels like a very racist place. Of course, as chair of Black Studies, I got a lot of hate mail, death threats, because the people were trying to find who was responsible for these two white men having to step down. And if they couldn't find anyone else, they would find the chair of the Department of Black Studies. So this is what's going on. The university then asked me to step in and develop a course, some kind of program for incoming students so that this would never happen again. I'm an ethnomusicologist, which I don't think there are any others in this room. But at the time I was teaching a class called Introduction to Soul and Country Music to a large class of 200 students. Loved that class because you would get students who were there because they love soul music and students who love country music, and they were so different. And so we would go on this journey trying to figure out what are the roots of soul and country music and find out that actually the roots are similar. You know, they're rooted in below the Mason-Dixon line and in the South. And in a certain kind of history. There were things that soul music and country music shared, but because of the industry and the society, they had created these very different audiences. So, so because I was teaching that class, I knew the impact of that kind of engagement. And because I was chair of Black Studies, I stepped in and I said, okay, let's create a course, a program for all of our incoming students called, at the time I called it Diversity at Mizzou. And at first, okay, folks were, and let's do music. Let's just do music. Because I believe that music is, and Sarah, you will agree, that, that music is really a way forward. Because who doesn't, is there anyone here who does not like music? Nobody. So, so I created a quick ensemble and charged those undergraduate students with choosing songs that they could perform on stage that would engage these 18-year-olds. And I said, make them classic songs, songs that they've heard, maybe their parents have played, but let these songs be meaningful and songs that can lead to dialogue. So they chose really great songs. Bob Dylan's Blowing in the Wind generated exceptional conversation around what the questions still were around politics, society. They chose the Beatles, John Lennon's Imagine, which actually had us think about religion and all kinds of things like democracy. But then I started getting calls from parents in the rural areas who were not happy with this program. And one of the students came up to me and said, Dr. Shonekan, it's not really about the program, it's about the name of the program. So change the name. They don't like that word diversity. So, so we brainstormed and my student said, let's call it Citizenship at Mizzou. And so I called it that and stopped getting calls. And then when students would come in, you know, they come in, and it's a mandatory program, but they come in and we're not lecturing them about microaggressions or white supremacy or anything like that. They're coming in, they're seeing their peers on stage, and it's music. So we did Black Eyed Peas, we did Michael Jackson, all of that. So it was a great program. I'm really proud of it. We talked to thousands of students, and we had conversation. We had mics in the audience, and students would engage. Now, there were moments where students would say things that the rest of the students would start to hum and then boo, and I would just stop it and I would say, nope, that's not what we're doing here. I want to talk a little bit about that when I respond to Jonathan. So Citizen at Mizzou was going on. And then the students evaluated the course, the program, and said, it's a 2-hour program. Some students, a few said it's too much, it should be 1 hour. But most students said 2 hours is not enough. It's not enough to really delve into why we should be dignified and respectful on this campus. And so we decided that we would think about what it would mean to expand it. At the time, there was a young professor on campus called Adam Seagrave, who was part of the Kinder Institute for Constitutional Democracy. And at the time, lots of my colleagues in Black Studies thought those were the evil ones. Like, we will not be talking with the Kinder Institute. But Adam approached me, and he was teaching a class on African American politics, which again, my colleagues were like, why is this white man teaching African American politics? But we looked at his evaluations. Students really liked him, liked his approach. And so we made him an affiliate of Black Studies. I felt it was important to have Black Studies representing not only Black folks, but other people who study and write about it. So Adam became a colleague. He approached me, said, Stephanie, let's move citizenship at Mizzou into a class. Let's make it a full semester. So he and I, he's a political scientist. Again, I'm an ethnomusicologist. We sat down and we developed a course with some of our colleagues. Kinder, Black Studies, History, Political Science. And we came up with this course called Race and the American Story, which I'm really, really proud of. We decided to come up with a list of texts that all of our students would read. We wanted students to think for themselves. I love what Jonathan said about not teaching them what to teach, but what to think, but how to think. So we thought, okay, let them read Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia. Let them read the Constitution. Let them read the draft that Jefferson had created for the Declaration of Independence. Let them read some Martin Luther King, some Malcolm X, some Sojourner Truth, some Frederick Douglass, and then make up for their minds how race has evolved, the construction of race has evolved over a period of time. We proposed it, it passed as a course, and we started off just thinking it's not mandatory, let's just see if students want it. We started with five sections, and all of them filled. And so I taught one, Adam taught one, and we realized, okay, all the white students are going to Adam, and all the Black students are coming to me. There's a problem here. Because we really wanted dialogue, and echo chambers are dangerous. So we decided that, okay, well, we can't force them to take either course, but we could create these opportunities throughout the semester where we get together and have dinner. And of course, the Kinder Institute, just like any of these wonderful schools that are popping up, have a lot of money. So they could pay for dinner for all the students. And that's where we started getting really incredible engagement. So we had them read, but we also had them think about music. I'm not going to be involved in any class that does not have music. So we asked the students to really think about what they're reading and how American music has helped form a soundtrack for American history. So for example, they would read Ida B. Wells' writings on lynching in the South, and we would ask them to think about music that helps with that. And of course, they would come up with Strange Fruit, and they would really listen to it and really unpack it in relation to Ida B. Wells' writing. And that became a really generative exercise. The program, Citizenship at Mizzou, to a class, and then Adam and I decided to create a symposium, which we did every year for a few years, and then other friends at other institutions heard about the course and joined the symposium, and it's still being taught at several places. I taught it last year at the University of Maryland as well. It's a great course. I am biased. So I'll conclude by saying, it's important that Adam and I, for us, to model what we want our students to also do. We're very different. He is from California, I'm from Nigeria, he's white, I'm Black. And so I do want to get to the other question about whether it's important to have a central list or some kind of great books that will help us think about these difficult subjects. And as dean of a college that's grappling with all these questions, I am thinking about a kind of a great books program, something like what's happening at Purdue with the Cornerstone Project. But I'm not there yet, because what happens is that the question of who gets to compose that list is problematic, right? If you look at the canon is still, whether it's music or literature or philosophy, is still very, very heavily Western Europe. We heard a lot about Aristotle this morning, and so many other of the Western canon. So I'd be worried about that. And this became a problem even for Adam and me, because we were who we were. We composed our list on black and white. And so over the years, we've had folks who want to teach it from an Asian American perspective. But because we have that list, it is non-exhaustive and not inclusive. So there are problems, I think, with a central list. I'll just end real quick by saying that in the case that I've talked about, it is about race. Race is difficult and is still very, very relevant, notwithstanding what is happening on at the federal level. And I'll tell you two quick stories. One is that when my mother was on her way out of this world, she became, I had to get her into a nursing home. She had dementia, and it was difficult. And so I went to visit her at the nursing home in Missouri. So imagine what the nursing home occupants look like, right? And my mother was the only Black woman in the facility. And one day I went in, I would go every day, and one day an older man who was also a resident there saw me and my mother and said, "What are those N-words doing here?" All the nurses rushed up, took him away. They came back and apologized, and they said, "This is so strange because he's forgotten his kids' names, but somehow he still remembered what an N-word looked like and why they should not be where he is." That was stunning. And then the second quick thing is a reminder that racism is not always personal. It's a systemic thing. When my daughter went to do her master's at Oxford, she tried to open an account. It was during COVID, and she had to upload her picture to the website of the bank to open her account. This is where all her scholarship would go so that she could eat and pay for school, and she couldn't open the account. And when we asked why, the bank said because she's too dark, so the software couldn't recognize her, so it rejected her. So therefore, she had to use her American bank account in England. This meant that she got charged fees. This meant that she was incredibly embarrassed with her cohort, who was all white. But no one at the bank was trying to be racist towards my daughter. And this is what was stunning. It wasn't about anybody. It was just about a system. So the system is still here. We still need to address it. And I'll stop there with my comments. Thank you.
Okay. I guess in the interest of time, John, if there's anything briefly that you'd like to respond to, then feel free.
It's just to say that I think it's absolutely wonderful that you are collaborating with Adam and the Kinder Institute. In our highly polarized country, we don't have enough of that, and I think it's beautiful. So thank you.
It does strike me that one of the themes between both of your works is that really one of the keys is just the personal contact. It's the ability to kind of get people together. And if diversity is a charged word, pluralism was one that people seem to like in our first session. And then put citizenship in there. That's also, maybe a recipe for lowering the temperature in some of these. All right, well, I'd like now to sort of turn to Michael and Aaron and give you guys a chance to sort of share your views and thoughts and build upon what's already been said. And I think one of the themes in the first session was that there, like every different place and every different community might have different sort of needs. And you two have been at OSU doing some of this this work, and just share your thoughts, share your ideas.
Go ahead, Chris. Cool. Can I have that mic? Sure. Awesome. Thank you.
I'm going to break the rules, but in a different way. Yeah, so I've really enjoyed this. Thanks so much for the opportunity to be here. It's so great to be on this panel. I think that when we're talking about the environment where civil discourse can happen, there's a couple things that just aren't going to be enough. So ideological diversity is important, but it's not going to be enough. Another thing that's not going to be enough is just talking about how great civil discourse is. Like, you know what I mean? Like, we can talk about it all day, but if we're not actually creating spaces where people want to do it, that's also not going to be enough. And what I think we actually need is really competent facilitation that only happens when we can have robust training in how to do this. And then we also need to have opportunities, scaffolded opportunities for students to have repeated experiences doing civil discourse where they get feedback, they get to try again, they get to make mistakes, and it becomes part of their life. And so what I thought I would do is just share a couple of stories about what this has looked like at Ohio State. So, and just to back up a little bit, my name's Aaron. Most of my published work is in philosophy for children, but most of my public engagement has been in like civil discourse. If you look at my op-eds, those are mostly what I'm focusing on right there. And I'm from the Center for Ethics and Human Values. We do a lot of civil discourse programming on campus. Last year, I think we had about 3,000 people who engaged with our civil discourse work online and in person. So I'll share just a couple of stories. One of them comes from an 8th grade class where I run a philosophy for children program. There was one day where I was doing an inquiry dialogue about the question, how should we respond to unjust laws? And some of the students decided that the unjust law example that they wanted to talk about was the example of bans on abortion. And and I asked the question, I said, well, do we all agree that this is an example of an unjust law? Like, I imagine that there's some disagreement about that. One of the students responded, well, I hope we all agree. And that was a threat right there, you know what I mean? That's something where it becomes the space where people don't feel safe to disagree with the position that it's an unjust law. And what I needed to do right then was diffuse it in a way that still showed respect for this student and didn't just shut her down, but made it really clear that that wasn't the kind of discussion we were going to have. And so the move that I made was to say, I know that there's going to be disagreement about this question in our communities, in our families, and in this room. So what could we do to make it feel comfortable for people to have different positions about this? And I said, let's start this way. What I want us to do is just to brainstorm some ways that somebody could reasonably disagree with the anti-abortion ban position. What are some reasons why somebody in good faith could support abortion bans? And we brainstormed some reasons. We talked about them. People talked about them in a way that was really charitable and curious and conscientious and constructive. And we were building towards like a better understanding of what the pro-life position looked like. And then after that happened, it was a really comfortable space for people to put forward all sorts of different positions. We got a really robust discussion. We ended up not using that example because we saw that it wasn't a place we were all going to agree that it was an unjust law. But that took competent facilitation. That took like a set of techniques that only come from a robust set of training, and our students need that as well. I'll give you another example. I was teaching a class once about the ethics of terrorism, and I'm anti-terrorism if you're curious what my position is about that. And one of the students got really upset because we were talking about the standard kind of political science definition of terrorism, which is like violence against a civilian target in order to achieve a political objective by a non-state actor, something like that. And one of the students got really upset because it was really important for him to think about his family as being subjected to terrorist violence from state actors. And so it was just a really emotionally difficult thing for him to be in that space and to see a definition that's this dominant definition within the field of political science that would just say that that doesn't count as terrorism at all. And I couldn't just stop the discussion entirely and say, okay, well, we're just going to change the definition, but I also needed to offer him some space. That's another tough facilitation puzzle moment. And so what I did was I said, I want to understand your perspective. Can you share with us like what you're feeling right now? And so he talked about that. He talked about his background. He talked about how important it was for him to criticize certain state actions as terrorism. After he got that out, other students started asking questions as well. They were asking him, tell me more. Like, I want to understand where you're coming from. What rival definition are you in favor of? And then after we did that, he was in a space where he felt like we heard him, we understood him. And so what we were able to do then was bring his perspective into the discussion in a way that was emotionally accessible for him, but still robust. And so what we then did was we talked about the costs and benefits of expansive versus very restrictive definitions of terrorism. So what are the benefits of a more restrictive definition? What are the benefits of a more expansive one? And we were able to then continue on with kind of the discussion in the classroom in a way that was robust and rigorous. But I couldn't have done that if I didn't have a really specific set of techniques for diagnosing problems in dialogue, then intervening to stop them. And I'll just give one more story. My colleague, Catherine Joyce, and I do a lot of dialogues. We'll facilitate dialogues in the community, on campus. We do it about a variety of topics, everything from what's going on in Israel and Palestine to the election, all sorts of things. And there was one dialogue we were doing where there was a retired nurse who was there. And her whole career had been women's healthcare. So for her to engage with the pro-life position was challenging because the way that she was approaching people who were pro-life was just to think they're just poorly educated about the science, or they're just trying to control women's bodies. And so the thing that we had to do was to get her to feel some curiosity towards people who she disagreed with. And I think actually getting people to feel curiosity is one of the most challenging things that you can possibly do in civil discourse and in dialogue. Because when you're curious, you're leaving a safe place. It's safe when you're just in debate mode. It's hard when you're actually open to learning from somebody you disagree with. And so we were able to just create a space where she could ask questions, like what are some reasons why somebody in good faith would take this position? And there was this beautiful moment where I could just see her shift towards regarding people who were pro-life with curiosity rather than just seeing them as people who just were mistaken. And so I say that to say that all that took, it took challenges, challenging facilitation moves. Now the way that we do that for our students on campus is basically threefold. We have one-off isolated workshops sometimes that address particular targets. So sometimes people will call us in to say, we're having trouble talking about Israel and Palestine. Can you give us a workshop about how to have this conversation better? Other times what we'll do is we have a class called Conversations on Morality, Politics, and Society. My favorite class to teach. I teach it every other semester. Catherine teaches it in the other semesters. We have a postdoc who also teaches it sometimes. And that's like a dialogue facilitation boot camp where I put people through very challenging drills so that they can see, they can basically push their facilitation techniques to the limit, find where it breaks, and then get feedback on how to do better so that when they're actually out there in the field talking to people, they have a framework of techniques that they can employ. From that class, I recruit a bunch of students for this advanced dialogue facilitation training group that I run in the evenings. We meet every week, and there we get even more advanced. So I pick apart people's technique really in a really detailed and methodical way. I had one student who had trouble not putting his own views into discussions, so I just made him facilitate over and over again discussions that were really meaningful to him, and I would stop him anytime he had inserted his own view. Another student who had trouble interrupting people in the discussion. So what I did was I had her interrupt me for 45 minutes one night, and then she was great afterwards. So we got to put them through that kind of training process. It's got to be rigorous. And then afterwards, they need to have opportunities to practice. And so we have opportunities all over campus for this. We've had Peter Levine speak at one of our Compass events, and that's a place where we can see reasonable disagreement about challenging issues. All of the most challenging issues we have civil discourse forums about. We had one about trans women in sports. We had one about the two-state solution. We had one about DEI on campus. These are all recent events. Students can come, and those are all student-moderated events also, so the students that we train moderate those events in particular. And then I have a series called Dorm Dialogues, where I go into a dorm building every other Wednesday night from 7:30 to 9 p.m. And I get students to come and talk about the most challenging issues that emerge in the context of shared living. Everything from the politics of thermostat setting to my roommate keeps having her boyfriend over and I'm not sure what to do, or navigating political disagreements in the dorm. All that comes out. So I listen to students tell stories, we find a question that actually means something to them, and then we facilitate a dialogue about that. And in all of those activities, I have the students that I've trained help me do that. So I have them actually help me do the facilitation for dorm dialogues and all of that. And so I think that like the upshot, the thing I'm trying to say is just, I think I'm preaching to the choir here based on the response I'm getting. Talking about civil discourse is not enough. Ideological diversity is not enough. Training and technique is needed, and it needs to be embedded within an interlocking ecosystem of opportunities for scaffolded instruction, improvement, and critique.
I don't know if I'll get to have my microphone activated. Should I use that one, or is there?
You're good.
Okay, great. Just so you know, I was on my phone to try to adapt my comments to my co-panelists, not because I was checking my email. So this is wonderful, and I think I'm going to be able to touch on issues that all three of my co-panelists raised, but my comments, I think, dovetail rather nicely out of Aaron's, in that I think technique is very important, and I'll have an anecdote. I think I bumbled. I'd like to make no claim to being reflective or virtuous about it, but I think I bumbled into some good techniques. But what I want to talk a little bit about is thinking about those techniques and the location of those techniques, not just as instrumental, but the principles behind them, and embedding them in a larger set of commitments. And I think if we do that, one of the things that emerges, at least in my practice, by the way, in the introduction, I'm both a professor, but I direct the Institute for Democratic Engagement and Accountability, and I was formerly affiliated with the Center for Ethics and Human Values. And so I have this co-curricular component to my work as well. And what's become clear to me is that I think there are different principles and different techniques to some extent. There are some overlapping ones that should apply in the classroom, in strictly curricular contexts, co-curricular contexts, and extracurricular contexts, and that it's useful to distinguish those. And I just taught my last session of a class called Education for Citizenship that the previous president of the university, through the vice president for government affairs, who was originally my co-teacher, asked us to develop the course. The thought being, this is our motto, and this seems like the moment to lean into our motto. And so I was like, okay, how are we gonna do this? And I did my PhD at the University of Chicago, by the way, and can get on board with the Chicago principles. I like to joke that everybody longs for the mothership. We kind of want to imitate how we did our graduate training, and to a large extent that's true for me. Though I do have some qualms about the Chicago principles outside of the classroom. I think inside the classroom, done in a certain way, I'm almost fully on board with them. And the reason I think that there's something distinctive about the classroom is that oftentimes in recent discourse about students not feeling comfortable speaking up, that the harm in that is glossed in terms of fairness or inauthenticity. And certainly fairness and authenticity are good things, but it seems to me that the harm in the classroom, and especially vis-a-vis the justification oriented around the Chicago principles, has nothing to do with fairness or authenticity. It's that the students are denying themselves and their classmates better opportunities to correct false beliefs, enrich nascent beliefs, and revitalize true beliefs. That this is the mission that we're pursuing in the classroom, which is truth. If that's the case, then it seems to me that directly pointing at better disagreements is a bad idea. They've got to be what philosophers call essential byproducts, or I guess that's redundant, got to be an essential. But I certainly hope that we can have better disagreements, but I think we get into mission drift and can invite some practices, at least I found myself, stumbling into practices that actually were in tension with the Chicago principles by just sort of hanging back and treating this as a matter of expressiveness or fairness, and encouraging authenticity for its own sake, rather than as a means to correct false beliefs, enrich nascent beliefs, and revitalize true beliefs. And you know, I don't know if this is you know, your experience, but I found myself sometimes wrong-footed in trying to maintain that sort of scholarly approach, and yet I haven't perceived, with the exception of Israel-Palestine, I hadn't really perceived that much of a change in students being willing to speak their minds. I realize I'm something of an outlier there, and that's where I think I stumbled into good practices or techniques. One of them being is one of the very first things I do, and this is like achingly simple and perhaps obvious, is right out of the gate, I introduce a topic, and I, from the front of the classroom, articulate a Burkean perspective on it, a libertarian perspective on it, a social democratic perspective on it, a communitarian perspective on it, a Christian democratic perspective on it, I'm probably a sort of radical identity politics perspective on it. And I think just hearing those come out of my mouth gives students permission, and there's much less self-censorship so far as I can tell. In the Education for Citizenship class, we also do an anonymous survey and build small groups and purposely engineer the groups to be diverse. They're permanent, so they develop ethos over time. I do think sort of ethos and emotional safety are very important. But again, in the classroom, I think we've got to think of these as instrumental to epistemic goals. And partly it's that I think that's what the classroom is suited for. Partly is that in life, eventually these will start to migrate between the curricular, the co-curricular, and the extracurricular contexts. As director of the Institute, we run a program called Shop Class for Democracy. And that, in a sense, is supposed to explicitly contrast with these sort of rarefied Chicago principle epistemic goals, because the idea of shop class is to learn how to use the affordances and tools of the American political tradition safely and constructively, right? In a practical, hands-on way. That's where the shop class metaphor comes from. I also happen to advise, and when I'm down here, my family lives in Chicago, I commute. But I live with 80 undergraduates, actually, when I'm down here, in a residential scholarship program. And when I'm advising them, it seems to me, then authenticity, expressiveness, emotional management, and better disagreements are direct targets. So it's not that I'm hostile to better disagreements or sort of this larger picture of educating students to be people. I do believe education as soulcraft, but I think that we should demarcate to some extent and at least put emphases, differential emphases on the sites that we encourage these because they have different functions. And what I've found is that the skills acquired in one, when they become the focus of that, they can really concentrate on developing those skills or areas of comfort or just through practice. They tend to migrate and subsidize the other sites of soulcraft. Let's see. I'm going to stop there because I think actually it might be more valuable just to use the rest of our time in a more free-floating way.
Great. Well, thank you all for really thought-provoking, I think, ideas. And based on this audience, I'm sure there are tons of questions. So I'm going to turn the floor over to questions. But I will sort of put it just as a pin in something that maybe as we move through this rest of the conversation, Stephanie, you did a great job of addressing the second question, which is sort of thinking about the benefits and trade-offs or not of a common curriculum versus the a la carte one. So if the opportunity from the audience questions emerge for you to address that, please do so. And I think we have a question right over here.
Can you guys hear me? All right, thank you so much for this very insightful panel and the panel prior to. I'm so happy that I'm actually able to address the question that I had for the previous panel through this as well. I have two separate issues that I actually wanted to hear from people about. I love what you guys have said, one about unhealthy versus healthy polarization. I'm the founder of a Black Lives Matter, but I'm here for a university today. So I get a lot of perspective on the nonprofit world with regards to, I've run for office 3 times, I've managed campaigns. So I've seen a lot. I worked for government before I got into higher ed, and I've been in higher ed for 3 years. I actually came to higher ed to escape government and make better plans and better models to send over to government. And so I've been listening in today on a lot of different things, and I just have a couple of things that, as a person who is from the outside of higher ed, and I still feel like I have not migrated to be a higher ed professional yet, there are some things that concern me when we talk about educators and their ability to teach civic engagement, right? And so I want to address one, we want to facilitate, yet we've never done. And so one of the things I always talk about on my campus is that we are not experts, but we have an expertise as teachers. I took a lot of courses on how to run for office, but when I ran for city council 3 times, it was absolutely different. And so sometimes I think we as educators are sitting teaching the material without ever really investing or immersing ourselves into it to know what the actual process is. And I think that that's a component where he talked about really good concrete facilitation, that we have to do the real work. And so while I love that you have your students learn all about it, because I do that too. I teach them dinner and a fight. We call it a breakfast brawl. We'll call it all sorts of things. And we've actually gone around in the state of Ohio and done it at other universities, teaching them the skill set, and it was taught to us, right? And it's a great opportunity. But our facilitation of the actionable item is that I want you to run for student senate. I want you to run for an executive position for a student org on campus, right? I want you to actually immerse yourself in the process so that you have a good understanding of what it looks like, right? But then what we need to teach our educators to do is to go to city council and actually go to a meeting. I was really shocked by how many people actually went to the meetings, right? Or even engage in the co-curricular space. So we talk about polarization, but we don't talk about the silos on campus between faculty and co-curricular. I'm in the co-curricular space. My faculty members in poli-sci, they may teach it, but I actually do the dinner and a dialogue. And they'll do their own sometimes and things of that nature, but where is the partnership where we need to sit down and we may not agree on how this gets done, but we need to teach and model the way for our students so they see us do it together, because I may be a better event planner and I know what the students will do that will encourage them to come to the event and be engaged in the event, and what activities should be a part of the event so that they want to feel like it's they're a part of it, so that they actually connect to it and take that information and continue to understand it and learn it. So I think that that's one of the components where we really love to hear your guys' perspective on. Like, if we're talking about polarization as a whole, as campuses, we have to talk about what does that look like as our silos, because that's just another form of polarization, and we're not actually modeling the way for our students to actually do the work. And then the second thing is diversity. Of course, I'm going to speak on it, right? I love the fact that we wanted to talk about it, but we're limited by perspective. You're from Nigeria. I just got back from Ghana, loved it. I went over there to teach universities the difference between actually selling their votes for clean drinking water, electricity, which are things that should be expected from politicians, and then going after your why for why you want to align with a party and things like that. But I was a spectator. I got to talk to them, I got to teach them different things that engage students, but I wasn't the one giving the full information. And I think that sometimes people of color in this community, in this country, we're like, well, where is the expert? Because out of the 8 people that have been up here, it's 1 out of 8. I came in this room, and when I sat down, I felt uncomfortable. And I understand respectability politics, right? And that's the social constructs that wins, and I understand disarming communication. But sometimes it feels like we're not even given the opportunity to give you disarming communication from our perspective, because what she looks at when she's talking about everything and everybody's got their perspectives is different from me. Because a moment ago when they talked about we all need to build a set of rules that'll be good for everyone, well, the rules have changed for my culture, and very much so. A lot of times we move the goal line. And it's okay to say that that has happened, because some good things have happened from that. Mary Jackson is a very well-known, prominent person. Everybody's seen Hidden Figures. She had to go and get a second degree to be able to
practice in engineering. That was a point where we moved the goal line. That woman had to do something extra. However, it allowed her to be the first African-American woman to integrate that schools district, right? And so there are good things that come out of it, but we have to talk about it. Like, that does happen. And I know it's uncomfortable, and it may make people feel some type of way, but we have to do that. And so sometimes when we're looking at that race in America and that diversity in America, we're not a monolith of people, right? And so we gotta make sure that we're including as many perspectives as we possibly can.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing that. Would any of the presenters like to respond?
Sure. Thank you. That was two really important and critical questions. I do want to take them both on, if I can, very quickly. To your last point first, I couldn't agree with you more that we need to make sure that we are hearing from multiple voices. And I love your last point about we are not a monolith, because even as Black folk, we are different. And don't ever call me a Ghanaian, like I'm West African, but get it right, right? But also here in the United States, Black folks in St. Louis have a really interesting culture that's different from Black folks in Chicago or in Maryland. And so we need to get that right. And I think that this is a chance to sort of challenge our centers because most of these centers are white. They are white spaces. And we get nervous when we are around folks that don't look like us. And so the challenge for these centers, as I said at Mizzou, kinder it felt Republican, white, like maybe not. But then when you get in there, and what kinder did really right was to encourage folks from Black studies and other parts of the university, journalism, to become affiliates of that center, so that you would go to a program and it would look so diverse in those ways. And the questions that would come out would really deepen and make the conversation so much richer. So I think that the centers have good intentions, but you walk into a space and it looks a certain way. Even though everybody up here had great points and is doing well and doing good and doing good work, how do we get to our students, the students in the Black Students Union, to actually come in? This is a question that I've been having with many of my folks in my units in the college. So yes. Second thing I would say to your first point is that, yeah, these campuses are very siloed. And we're siloed in terms of our disciplines, let alone in terms of where we sit on the academic side versus the other side. I am on a search committee to hire a new athletic director at Maryland. And it's so interesting that the difference between athletics and academics, huge. There's like a big chasm between what the athletics folks want and what the academic folks want. So yes, the silos are real. But what I've done, I'm sure there are lots of examples of how folks have tried to break those silos down, and it sounds like you're pushing, and I'm hoping that there's some grace there so that people can really learn. So we decided that because of what was going on, we've had a lot of our trans students at Maryland become very uncomfortable and fearful for their lives. And so we decided, and then a group brought in a speaker, an anti-trans speaker, to talk about trans women in sports. And so our students said, oh my gosh, how could the university allow this to happen, blah, blah, blah. And I said, no, go listen, go and hear what they have to say. And then I thought, arts and humanities, we have experts on trans identities. Let's have a pop-up discussion about trans identity, trans folks, awareness. And I decided to have graduate students, faculty, and a staff member who's doing work with the trans students. Like, like what that person could bring to that panel was like real life, real-time examples of what trans folks are going through at the University of Maryland. So the professor spoke from, the history of this, and so on. It's happening in India, and all of these great points, but very academic, like very scholarly. And that's good, because we are an academic institution. But then our colleague from the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, who talks with trans students every day, was able to say, all that is good, but also here's what I'm hearing from our students. And it was like a new model, to actually have a panel of experts that included both the scholars and the practitioners. And I kept it just 1 hour, but we could have gone for 3 more, because the faculty had questions for the staff, and the staff had questions for the faculty. So I think that that's a good model of how that can happen. And we should do it more.
All right, I see a hand up here, and did I miss one over here? Okay, the mic is closest here, and can you work the mic over towards Heather? Yeah, go ahead. Sure. Yeah. Okay. Or Heather.
Oh, good.
Yeah, I was told you don't need to touch the mics; they will go live.
So this is a question for everyone on the panel. I'm hearing a lot about these wonderful sounding programs, institutes, required courses, and all of it's taking place at sort of 50,000 feet up, which makes a ton of sense, right? Because we're trying to touch as many students as possible. I was just wondering, though, if any of you had anything to say or any thoughts about whether or not specific disciplines are more or less suited for doing this kind of work. And the reason I'm asking, in full disclosure, I am a philosophy professor, is I heard Aaron's description about what happened in the course when, we tried to tease out the reasons why somebody might be pro-life, right? And I heard Michael's comments about prioritizing truth, and I'm just thinking it's like, yeah, that's just what a philosophy class is. I mean, that's how that always goes. So yeah, to land at the question here, I guess I just have questions about like specific disciplines and how that might fit into the kind of work you're doing.
I have some thoughts on that. I have a sort of odd status here. I have appointments in 4 departments. I direct the institute, and I'm affiliated faculty with 4 other units. Yeah, it is too many meetings, Ross. You are absolutely right. And for whatever it's worth, so I was a philosophy undergraduate and applied to only 2 political science programs. The rest were philosophy departments. I still joke to my courtesy colleagues in philosophy that I want to be a philosopher when I grow up. So as to the question as to whether different disciplines might have differential advantages on this, my thinking on that is yes, but. So yes, in that I think this is just what philosophers or political theorists, in my case, do, and yet there are things that the other disciplines can bring to bear on it that are of enormous value if they think of it in those terms. I think not all philosophers, but I think quite a few philosophers are prone to think in these terms to begin with. What I was talking about in terms of like just trotting out the different arguments, that this isn't about, that there's nothing special about the fact that I'm articulating this view. For purposes of the seminar, it becomes the disembodied property of the deliberating community, right? But when I'm leading a discussion in the residential community on gender dynamics, in that I appealed to St. Francis, first let me understand, rather than be understood, right? And that wasn't about truth, at least initially. I think ultimately it can be, but and that let's say psychologists can tell us about the emotional preconditions for being able to be in a posture, receptive to logical argumentation. I think communication theorists can tell us about the rhetorical tropes and techniques that are likely to be persuasive, and then philosophers can push back and say, yes, but are those purely instrumental, or are they bound by norms of and then political scientists can describe when those norms are observed and not observed in civic life. And that in a way, I think goes back to the previous question. I wear many hats, but I try to stay in my lane when I'm in a particular role, because I wield the status of being a professor whether I want to or not. And a lot of times I'm speaking about things that I have no professional expertise on, and yet it is attributed to me. And so I think if we're not very careful about that, we can it feels good to be the expert on everything when we're not experts on everything. So I think it's more, and we have a great dean of engineering here who's very interested in something you think might have nothing to do with civics, and yet civil engineering and many other facets of engineering, I think, can be brought to bear. And as a group, our disciplinary training is different, but we tend to be pretty thoughtful people. And if you can just train your attention on what your discipline has to say about civic education, education for citizenship, civil discourse, these sorts of things, I think then it becomes less the provenance of particular disciplines.
Can I add one really quick thing?
Sure, please.
So, like you, I teach philosophy. I also lecture in the philosophy department. I did my PhD in philosophy. I did my bachelor's degree in violin performance, and part of why I went over to philosophy was that I just thought the tools they were offering me for thinking about the questions I cared about were just so much better than what I was getting in violin lessons. And so we can talk more about it. I love theory and musicology too. So the thing I wanted to mention was that I do think that philosophy gives you unique skills and abilities. I think that other disciplines can have those as well. One of our programs that we have at our center is this Drake Institute teaching endorsement, where we actually train teachers to have these facilitation techniques, to be able to teach controversial issues in the classroom with some level of expertise. So they're not just bringing expertise, they actually have some, it's not just subject matter expertise anymore, it becomes expertise in facilitation as well. And one thing I've noticed is that sometimes people from other disciplines have to have a little bit of an adjustment period where they're learning about this creative way of finding open questions within their disciplines to talk about where there's reasonable disagreement. And I think the fundamental difference might be that when we're approaching things within a philosophy department, we're confronted with reasonable disagreement from the get-go. There are very few things that have been settled. Maybe Gettier got us some progress, but it's very not often the case that we just get a decisive refutation. And so, but for other disciplines, that's not quite as common. And so sometimes they have to work a little bit harder to get that orientation where then they can go into a classroom and approach things with reasonable disagreement. That's one thing that I've noticed, but I think that anybody can learn it.
I'm disciplinary bound to say history sort of provides context, and I like to say it practices empathy. You have to, reading through what it is people of the past thought helps you better relate to people who are different from you today. There's a question up here in the top. Yeah. It'll come on.
It'll come on? Okay.
Yep.
So, enjoyed the first panel, thought this panel was really fascinating. I wanted to jump to the point that you made, your first statement about how do we encourage breaking these silos and working together. So I consider myself to be unique. I'm a OSU poli-sci PhD, and I moved right up the street to a SLAC, and now I'm co-directing a civic center with my co-directors over there. And right now, we're in all of these different meetings, but there's one big thing that we had been tasked with trying to figure out a way to promote constructive dialogue on our campus. And there's this lofty goal where all of our students will have to complete this dialogue training in 2 years. And we're trying to figure that out. But we're not working through this alone. And so like we had created a committee of folks from like multicultural student affairs, there's faculty from communication, the HR directors involved, persons involved with our career center, study abroad, et cetera. And I think one of the things that I've realized now that I'm at a SLAC is that there is this promotion of collaboration. And so I think one of the ways that we could break down those walls is perhaps if the institution incentivizes such collaboration, and I know that's easier said than done at a R1 than it is at a SLAC, but other ways that it could be done is, yes, continue working with the students and things of that sort, but I think maybe looking at the specific faculty that you think, so long as they're tenured, because now I'm tenured, it's like, yeah, free schedule, but look at those individuals that you think might be interested. Yeah.
Great. I think we have time for one more question, Jeremy. Is that okay? Any other?
I have a question for you about facilitation. When you're facilitating for students, do you feel like you're facilitating more for emotional intelligence so that they can actually participate? Because what I find on my campus is like our pockets of students identify as something, and their polarization is usually attached to that. So I have groups of students, like my young white male students. I actually had a graduate assistant who opened my eyes. He came to me and he was like, how do I help you solve the problem if you call me the problem? And so that really opened my eyes to starting to look through his perspective on race, equity, diversity, inclusion. And then I started to learn that a lot of my young white students who don't come out, and I'm really vocal about this on campus, that are conservative students, they don't want to be told, no one to know that they're conservative students. They don't want anybody to challenge them on their views or even learn any other views, which is a really sad thing. But they're labeled as bad. And so then you have the black students who label us trying to do this as like performative because you want us to die. And then our Hispanic students are like, everybody just wants us deported. And it's like, how are we teaching? Do you think that you're facilitating to their emotional intelligence to understand the world and how we operate and how we can do better, and that these things will happen, like your party will lose. And sometimes you're gonna have to figure out how to work. You know, you can agree on these things where you can meet on the middle, these things you're gonna stand across the aisle, but it's like your emotions are gonna play a part, and how do you control that so that you can articulate yourself as well as move through in a way that we all get to the same goal, because we just have different inroads to the same goal.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a great question. I think that the compliment that I got from a student that was by far the most impactful for my life from early on in my teaching career was a conservative student came up to me and said that my classroom was the first one where she felt comfortable expressing her views. And then she told me a couple of horror stories about other classes that she had been in. And I think that you're right that the emotion, and I've noticed this in other places too. I've done inquiry dialogues where the biggest challenge is to get the students who voted for Trump to feel comfortable sharing that. And to say, like, I really want to hear your perspectives. I don't want this to be a space where you have to feel any sense of self-censorship, or that people are going to treat you as somebody who's coming from bad faith, or that we're going to question your motives. Like, we just want to have mutual understanding and find a question that we all care about. And so I think that, like, keeping the emotional state of your students in mind is very important, because if they don't feel comfortable, if they're afraid of what's going to happen if they share like the wrong views, that's going to be a problem. If they don't trust me, if they think that there's a space where they're just going to talk in a way that's not going to actually lead to any sense of progress, that's another problem. And then if they're bored, that's another problem. So what we also have to do is pitch something that speaks to their emotions in that way as well. You talk about like love. There's this sense of like, erotic love, but there's also kind of the eros of the inquiry that I think like we get in Plato, where I want to be able to pitch something to them that like stimulates like the pathos, in a way that drives them to actually pursue the inquiry. And the last thing that I think is probably the most important thing when I'm thinking about the emotions of my students is that I want it to feel like an invitation to play. I want it to feel like when my dog comes over to me, gives me like a play bow and is like, let's play fetch. That's what I want a good inquiry to feel like about the most challenging topics. And I think those three things are part of the way. I have a much longer answer that I can't give out of time, but thanks for the question.
All right.
One
Yes, please do.
Because I know we're ending. So the thing that people, like the students in our classes who are worried about coming out as conservative or liberal or whatever, right, is they're scared of cancel culture. This is something that Jonathan writes about in his piece. And cancel culture is real. We cancel folks who we want to cancel folks who we disagree with, who we're scared of, who we don't really want to contend with. This is what canceling is. And so it's never good. We want to cultivate environments where students feel that they can step up and say something without the fear of being quote unquote canceled. As I was growing up in Nigeria, there was an incredible artist called Fela Anikulapo Kuti. If you listen to Afrobeat, you know that name. He really said a lot about what was going on in the post-colonial Nigeria, and the government really canceled him. And I think that Nigeria is in the state that it's in because we canceled voices like Fela. History was removed from the curriculum at one time. And so what is the psychology of a people when they don't have access to the broad and full history? And so I do want to also put out a challenge that removing books and telling folks what they can read and what they cannot read is a form of canceling. And we should all together be pushing back against the impulse to remove books from libraries and bookshelves like at the Naval Academy, because that is a kind of cancel culture. We're scared of what those books say, and we don't want to contend with it, so remove it. It's the same thing that is happening in our classrooms, and we should all be kind of sitting up and rising up against that. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you, panelists, for a great talk.